So, welcome today to a deep dive into a really fascinating topic that was prompted by a paper that was recently released by the Center for Global Development. I've got with me today Anthony McDonald, the lead author on that paper, and Kevin Otterson, who is often part of discussions around here about things. And so, just to mention Kevin briefly for those of you who don't know him, he's a lawyer who uses law and economic tools to think about the problem of antibiotic resistance. And Anthony McDonald is a true card carrying economist who I first met 2015-ish, Anthony, when you joined the UK AMR Review. And so the theme for today is going to be the paper that you just released called The Economics of Antibiotic Resistance. Would you give us just a few seconds on how you got started on thinking about that paper? And then I'd like you to take us on a tour of the paper itself.
Yeah, so how we got started was quite simple. I was giving a presentation and a colleague of mine, Renil, said, "This is fascinating. Is there any good literature on this where I could read more?" And we tried to find something that summarized the economic challenges and realized that there wasn't a good paper. The bits of the story were scattered all over the place. And so we decided we'd come together and write it.
Right. And so we've often talked about, the need for antibiotics and how they face this peculiar paradox. But what I thought was very nice about your paper was the way that you really stepped back from it and said, in economic terms that mere mortals can understand, as opposed to pure economists, what is it that actually causes antibiotics to tip over and do a faceplant? So why don't you give us a little tour of the paper, and then we're going to ask you a few questions. Off to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. So briefly, as most of you probably know if you're watching this, antibiotics sustain healthcare systems. There's been a huge reduction in the burden of mortality in the 20th century from infectious diseases. In 1900 in the US, 800 people per 100,000 died of an infection. By 1930, that had fallen to 293 people. And by the 1980s, there was just 36 deaths per 100,000 people from infectious disease. And most of that last increase comes from the invention of antibiotics. We suddenly had a way of curing these diseases that seemed fatal. But antibiotics haven't only done that. They have allowed for lots of other parts of medicine, such as complex surgeries, transplants, and oncology care, because suddenly we can treat people in a way that exposes them to huge risk of infection, knowing that if they get infected, we have a cure for it. And so like water in the desert or in a savanna, they allow and sustain the entire healthcare system. And they come from science, but good science requires good economics. It's not difficult to make microbes resistant to penicillin in the laboratory by exposing them to concentrations not sufficient to kill them. Alexander Fleming said that in his Nobel Prize address in 1945. So we've known about this almost as long as we've had antibiotics themselves. And if you look at the graph in my slides, it shows 7 pictures of very long Petri dishes. And there's different levels of antibiotics on the Petri dish, none at the start, then 3 times the amount of antibiotic needed to kill a bacteria, and it gets stronger so that at the end of the Petri dish, it's 3,000 times more antibiotics than needed to kill a bacteria. And you see that immediately the bacteria inhabits the antibiotic-free part of the Petri dish. And then they slowly creep into the more and more stronger and stronger bacterial space, so that after 264 hours, they are almost completely oblivious to the antibiotics that are surrounding them. And so the question that we have, and policymakers and clinicians and others have to think through, is how do we avoid the kind of situations that we can so easily engineer in a lab happening in real life? And I would contend that many of the reasons why we are failing to keep things at bay in real life are fundamentally economic challenges. The first one is that antibiotics is a common pool problem. The best way to think about a common pool is to think about fishing. Every fisher, man or woman, loses out if fish stocks are depleted. But there are thousands and thousands of fishers, And so each one is negligible in their contribution to the pool and supply of fish going extinct. So it's in each individual interest to fish as much as possible, hoping that other people fish less. And they'll know that if they restrain themselves from fishing, other people will catch that additional stock. Similarly, nobody is incentivized to look after fish supply or do anything with fish habitat to increase the number of fish, because they know other people will just catch those fish. And essentially the same problem is true of antibiotics. They're a finite resource where we have no effective mechanisms to moderate demand. And that is kind of the first of the 10 problems we identify that constrains antibiotic resistance. And to continue on the common pool and the pool problem, one way we've thought about antibiotics is to think about the antibiotic supply as a pool. And if that pool is full, then we can say that we can treat all infections very cheaply and quickly and easily in the world, all bacterial infections. And if the pool is empty, we have no antibiotics. And generally, the fuller the pool is, the happier and healthier our antibiotic supply chain is, and the more infections we can treat. The pool is depleted for two reasons. First of all, the pipeline for antibiotics is not putting nearly enough water into that pool to keep it going. And then we are wasting the pool that we have by using it inappropriately in a series of ways. And each of these has its own kind of failures to it. There is insufficient funding for early stage research, which groups like Kevin are doing their best to overcome, but we still need to fund more early stage research. We need better incentives for academics to take on antibiotic research. We need to make it easier to do clinical research, and the market for antibiotics needs to be stronger to fund research at the end. And these 5 failings all have economics at their root. Antibiotics are public goods. All innovation is really a public good. If I come up with anything novel that somebody else can copy, that is of little value or less value to me, because all of my work and effort will be equal of value to me as to the person who's copied my work. In all of pharma, to prevent this, we have patents and market exclusivity to give people a monopoly over their product for 20 years usually, to reward them for that innovation. And the problem is that that system just doesn't work very well for antibiotics. And the reason for this is that the social and private value of new antibiotics are poorly aligned. If I take an antibiotic and it cures me of a bacterial resistant infection quickly, so I don't pass it on to anyone, that quicker treatment is of some value to me, but it's of much greater value to society, because other people don't get sick either. There are regulatory challenges that exacerbate market failures. It's often very hard to prove that an antibiotic is good because antibiotics against susceptible infections are so good already that there's challenges on proving things regulatory, and these hurdles make it hard to prove antibiotics are effective. Antibiotics have a huge insurance value. If you've watched any of John's videos, you've probably heard him talk about how they're the fire extinguishers of modern medicine. We have fire extinguishers in our houses so that if there's a small fire, we can put it out quickly and we don't lose our whole house. We don't think of those fire extinguishers as being hugely valuable or as valuable as the house. And in medicine, we tend not to pay for things to have at bay in case there is a problem. We tend to use them when there is a problem. But because of the limited nature of patents, if you create a drug that offers us insurance against a possible threat of resistance, and that threat doesn't come along, you don't make any money. And finally, the market completely fails to provide access to antibiotics to people across the world. 8.8 million people die of bacterial infections. Only 1.27 million people die because of antibiotic resistance. And so we need to do far more to get those drugs to people who need them. And that will, in many cases, reduce unnecessary use too, because people will use the most effective antibiotic for them rather than the antibiotic that's available. So similarly, there's 4 failures causing antibiotic pool to be overused. We have poor infection control, so more people are sick and need antibiotics, and thus resistance goes up. We prescribe poorly. There's environmental pollution and agricultural pollution, and the roots of these again are economic. infection control is a public good. It benefits all of society. Public goods are things that are non-rivalrous, non-excludable. And so you can't charge for public good unless the government comes in and does it, because we all benefit from it. And that means that we underinvest in infection control. There's a mismatching problem. Often we do not know what the best antibiotic a person needs is. Diagnostics would greatly improve this because we could get the most effective treatment for a person, and thus we would reduce the risk of resistance. And then there's negative externalities around both environmental pollution and agriculture. Negative externalities or positive externalities are the impacts that your decision has on other people in society. So if I have a very loud party at 3 a.m. and wake all of my neighbors up, that will be considered a negative externality because I get all of the benefits of the party, but they suffer much of the costs. And similarly, with antibiotics, when pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers dump active pharmaceutical ingredients into rivers, they save some costs. It's easier than deactivating those ingredients. And when farmers overuse antibiotics, they save some money by not investing in infection control as much and other things. But as society, we all pay the cost of this. And one of the surprising things about this is that it's generally not very expensive to clean and deactivate active pharmaceutical ingredients. And it might add 1 or 2% to the cost of meat in high-income countries to reduce our reliance on agriculture, but the farmers and manufacturers have very little incentive to do this. However, despite all of these problems, there are reasons to be cheerful. Through a combination of push and pull funding, these pipeline leaks can be solved. There has been a huge increase in push funding, as I mentioned, over recent years, which is funding for early stage research. And the UK in particular, but other countries are looking at ways where they can buy antibiotics on a subscription model, making the pipeline much healthier. And if these things go through, we will not have the same leaks of the pipeline as before. There's a lot of experience with externalities, and well-designed regulation and taxation can remove most of them. If I have that party at 3 a.m., the police will likely come to my house because that's regulation. Diagnostics and infection control have the potential to greatly reduce resistance by identifying which antibiotics we need and by stopping people from getting sick in the first place. We know how to do infection control. There's a lot of innovation needed around diagnostics, but as we were discussing just before this started, it does not get the prioritization it deserves. And often it feels like the IT revolution has left how we diagnose people from infections behind. And the amount of money we need are quite small. Kevin has done some research to show that you need about $3.1 billion for every new antibiotic that is successful, which might sound like a lot of money, but that puts a new antibiotic at about a third as much revenue per year required as the 200th best-selling drug in the world. Indeed, 48 drugs in the world sell more than $3.1 billion in 2021. And so we're not talking about making antibiotics into these blockbuster huge drugs, but there needs to be enough money where it pays to invest in them. And finally, countries do need to come together and solve these global solutions. And we have done this many times before about many other global problems that we have fixed. And in 2024, the world meets at the UN General Assembly high-level meeting to hopefully sign an ambitious political declaration around antimicrobial resistance. And I hope that is where we start to really turn a corner on this. You can find out more about this by reading our paper, The Economics of Antibiotic Resistance. And I just want to give a big shout out to my 4 co-authors, Renil, Catherine, Flavio, and Michael, who were brilliant researchers and fundamental to this project as well. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Fabulous. Thank you for that quick tour. And I have to say, I almost titled my newsletter, 4 Economists and a Pediatrician Walk into a UN high-level meeting. But I thought that wouldn't quite come across as clearly as the title that I did go through, which was How Economists and Finance Ministers Think. And to me, that was actually the fun of this, was that one of the things I've learned over time, and I've really learned it a lot from Kevin, is that we have to tell stories that change the way a finance minister sees the problem. And so this is where this starts. So Kevin, let me start with you. Questions or comments for Anthony?
Every other drug class in history, those drugs are going to work great in 50 or 100 years. The aspirin I took this morning, it's not going to damage the use of aspirin in 5 years. or if people are on cancer drugs or heart disease drugs, innovation in biopharmaceuticals, it works forever except with antimicrobials. And for those, as soon as we've gotten something wonderful like penicillin, you have to start all over again because, eventually evolution's going to wreck it. And so this problem, what an economist would call rivalry, or the fact that use of these drugs and only these drugs diminishes the future use of these drugs. That is unique to antimicrobials, and it completely undermines and flips on its head. This is what I've been writing about for 20 years as an academic. It flips on its head all the assumptions about intellectual property and IP theory in this space. So let me do a separate thought. If we're of a certain age, we read, that famous paper, Tragedy of the Commons, in undergraduate plow, and it's a common pool resource problem. It's not a pond or a lake, but it's grazing commons, right? And Hardin's solution there was, let's fix the problem using property. If one person owns all of it, there's a way to fix it. That won't work with antibiotics, because even if somebody owns the patent forever, other drugs that are unrelated to this drug can also cause cross-class and cross-drug resistance. And I know, John, that you have direct experience with this. Other ways to address this might be through contract or regulation. And if this is cooperative in the contract realm, Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom, her life work was on this issue. Can people cooperate and work their way out of this sort of a problem? For regulation, that's the EPA. Let's have the government try to make sure this pond isn't overfished, or the Fish and Wildlife Services or whatnot. And then the fourth major legal tool is tort. Can we make people pay damages? So here's a pond, it's got fish in it, or in Anthony's example, a lake, and we're trying to make sure there's adequate clean water. The goal for the planet is we need to manage this resource called effective antibiotics well. And we have lots of tools, legal tools, economic tools, and they are all pointing in the same direction. And that slide that Anthony showed with all the ways to increase the supply and all the ways to dampen the demand, you could just put the agencies, the CDC, their job is to dampen the demand. CARB-X, our job is to add more things to the supply. We are already working on all these pieces because all of us have, even if it's not in the fore of our minds, the legal tools and the economic tools of how do we solve a common pool resource problem. So, if this is a way, this paper, for other folks to look at this, to realize, yes, this is a problem we recognize. We don't want to overfish. We don't want to ruin the water we drink from, right? We need this to be effective for generations and take a broader approach to different ways to solve it. I think it's a wonderful paper and a wonderful time for this to be introduced into a larger discussion.
So I'd like to pick up on the question of storytelling around this being a market failure, and something that I recall in some conversations of 4 or 5 years ago when Kevin and I were speaking with some economists who worked in the US government. And there was a real question about, is it a market failure? One of the economists looked at this and said, I'm not sure this is a market failure. And to me, the strength of what you've done here is you've not only said it is a market failure, but you've actually put it in words, put it in pictures in a way that I may not know what non-rivalrous means, but I do understand there not being enough water to fill my tap. And so that concept of how do you use this information? Because this is the thing that we've all got to do this year. We've got to help health ministers, help finance ministers, help the presidents of countries understand why they need to get behind doing some of this stuff that costs money. So how do we use this language? And do either of you have experience? We just start, for example, like with the UK and their project. Did this come up? How did this come up? What lines of storytelling actually made the biggest difference?
Governments are intriguing. Obviously, they're made up of lots of people, but predominantly they think like economists and how to manage resources, and they speak like lawyers and they write laws and stuff. And those are the kind of the two main tools and disciplines that feed into how we do government. And generally, most economists think that you shouldn't interfere with a market unless there's a market failure. And it's often said that economists are way too market driven, but it's worth noting that economists spend more time thinking about where the market doesn't work than anybody else. All of economics, or not all, but most of economics is about identifying the parts of the economy that don't work and thinking about how we fix it. The reason we do this is because it doesn't make sense for the government to get involved in a market where it's working very well. Food is essential. It's the most important thing. It's more important than medicine. We have a national health service. We don't have a national food service in the UK because there's people there to supply me with food. The market works very well. Some people can't afford the food, so we step in those situations. But for most people, the market works well, so why intervene? Governments can do lots of things. There are so many things that you could ask the government to do, but the reason to get involved here is because there is a market failure, and you cannot just rely on people doing what is in their enlightened self-interest and having the system work. And that will happen with food supply, but it doesn't happen with antibiotics. And that is why there needs to be a government intervention here. And our goal here was to lay that out clearly, because there are so many economists in government and they really permeate how governments think about problems.
Well, and that was exactly the question that we were being asked. If it's not a market failure, the government doesn't need to do anything. But so let me go one step further then, maybe point to Kevin. What I know that we ultimately won that conversation. Ultimately, people's minds were switched over. What did it take? And how do we use these ideas? How do we get these ideas? Is there even shorter version of this? Anthony's given us a 10-minute tour. What's the elevator pitch tour of this version of this? And how do we do that? How do we use it?
I think governments are used to having companies and industries coming in and asking for money, and so they have natural and correct defenses to well, tell me why this is really necessary, as opposed to you just would like money from us, right? And so it's important for them to do this sifting and to be careful with how government and charitable resources are deployed. So I'm in favor of that. I think the key here was that it wasn't a couple of companies going bad, like some company made a bad decision, went under. It's really all of the small companies with an FDA-approved product or a phase 3 product were suffering either bankruptcy, liquidation, distressed sale, or layoffs. It's not like any of them were succeeding. And then also it's important to speak the correct language back to the correct groups. So, economists speaking to economists, and lawyers using some of the same tools to speaking to lawyers. And there's a professor, Isaac Weldon, who's a political scientist, and he writes about common pool as antibiotics, but from a political science standpoint, trying to convince that sort of part of the world. So I do think that this is something, and you hear Prime Minister Mia Mottley, the co-chair of the Global Leaders Group on AMR, and therefore, Barbados. And Barbados is one of the 2 countries that will co-convene the UN General Assembly high-level meeting. And she speaks of antibiotics as the effectiveness of them being a global common good. This is something that's a public good, something we all need to work on together. This is a politically modified version of the same idea, that this is an important resource. We share it together. It can be exhausted. We can ruin it. But if we work together, we can make this last, right? And that core story is now being told in multiple angles, multiple disciplines. And I'm grateful for the paper that, maybe this will penetrate new audiences.
Can I quickly follow up there? It's often people act like the market works really well in pharmaceutical research and you want to change the market. And that's fundamentally not true. We decided in the late 19th century that we couldn't encourage innovation by letting the market do it. And so we created patent systems that meant that if you spent what is today billions of dollars investing in a new drug, that you would get some ownership of that drug and some protection from generics. That is not a private sector thing. That is the government coming in and gifting companies who are successful a tool. Governments also mostly buy new medicine. The global, there's 1.4 trillion spent on drugs every year. Even in the United States, which is quite a comparatively private-driven system, half of the spending on pharmaceuticals are done by governments. And the third thing is, where the market hasn't worked for other areas of medicine, we have come and stepped in. There is an Orphans Drug Act because we did not fund rare diseases enough. There are special rules in insurance around vaccine manufacturers because people were leaving that space in the 1980s. It is not, the problems are maybe a little unusual or different for antibiotics, but the idea that there is a problem and the state needs to step in isn't. We have done it so many times before for antibiotics, and I think it's often too quickly dismissed as the idea that antibiotics think they're exceptional and they want something different. Well, like everybody, we want a system that works for antibiotics as it works for many parts of medicine.
So what you two are saying collectively is we do have political leadership who have learned the ideas and they're actually putting them into their own words. And you're also saying that the need for government to step in for antibiotics is not unusual. We needed it for vaccines, as the example you pointed out. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, those are helpful ways to encapsulate this, because the concern that I so often hear is, well, Pasteur's, it's a lot of money to give to the pharmaceutical industry, but in fact, it's not a lot of money in the economist view of things, which is a different way of looking at the world. The economists think of $1 billion as, well, that's kind of a rounding error in their world. And truth is, it is. And yet not having an antibiotic is not a rounding error for you if you're the person who's got the resistant infection and about to die. So it's, how do we get all that to align? Fascinating. So we need to draw this to a close, but let me just ask each of you for sort of other thoughts about this topic and how we're going to use this topic. And as you know, I'm very interested in storytelling. I think a good story makes a big difference in getting through people's heads. The fire extinguisher thing that I said Kevin and I collectively invented while standing in the hallway. Was it in Oslo? I think I believe we were in Norway or we were in Sweden, but it was one of those Drive AB meetings where we're standing in the hallway and the fire extinguisher concept popped out of our mouths. Is there an equivalent of that for this? Is there a 3-word version of the dismal science here that actually makes all of this really actually happen?
So I'm gonna say, first of all, make the dismal science look less like it's on an ivory tower. I think that economists wouldn't say that $3 billion is a small amount of money. What economists do is contextualize things. And so there is economists who pour over costs to poorest people in the world that are mere cents and seem insignificant to most people in high-income countries. And there's economists who spend a lot of time thinking of state expenditure. But I just looked it up. In the US, there is $420 billion are spent every year on prescription drugs. About half of that is done by the federal government. The federal government is happy to intervene in this huge way, and so I do often find it strange that there's so much is made out of the $3 billion. And I don't have a brilliant 3-word line, but I think we just have to try and continue to put these things in the context that it's not a huge amount of money and these aren't huge changes.
For what you get, right? Yeah.
For what you get, of course, yeah, because what you get is huge.
Yeah. Kevin?
I think for that 3-word line, we need the people who do Super Bowl commercials in the U.S. We need really experts and memorable short things. But if you'll indulge me, I have a story about Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen.
Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen. All right, rock on.
For context, you and I've talked about this before, and you've had many things on your blog about, the role of antibiotics or how antibiotics would have changed the plot. Because truthfully, prior to antibiotics, lots of people died from bacterial infection, and it became a major plot point in various books. And you've got a series of films and books that you talk about in the blog. It's wonderful. But I was thinking about Pride and Prejudice the other day. And, the core problem there is that, Mr. Bennet had inherited, they could only go to his son, and he had 5 daughters and no son. And so that's called, it's a property interest that there's a future interest holder. So he's not able to inherit, to devise it to his, because he only had daughters. And there's somebody else who has the future interest. And that individual is the slimy Mr. Collins. The guy nobody likes in the BBC movie, But the English law addressed this problem in 1278 in the Statute of Gloucester. And they said that if you own a property right, but it's time limited, and there's somebody else who will inherit it later, there's certain things you can't do. So Mr. Bennett having the property, he cannot sell the manor house. He cannot cut down the trees and sell them. He can't sign 50-year leases for the land and take that cash and give that cash to his wife and daughters. He can't do that. Why? It's because that would damage the future interest holder, the person who's going to get the property in the future. He has a time-limited right. So I think one way to think about this is that the English solved this problem in 1278. We are time-limited interest holders, and in today's antibiotic effectiveness, we have to be thinking about the future users of antibiotics, and so we have to pass something on to them that's useful and not damaged, which is what the English law required of Mr. Bennett, right? And so Pride and Prejudice, once again, key to antibiotics understanding, this time economics, common pool resources, future interest. It's a nerd fest, but thank you.
Fabulous. Well, if you're watching this video, look down below. We're going to have the link there to the Sense and Sensibility video, to the English, to 3 or 4 others. I'm just going to tell you there's some great stories out there. But the idea of Pride and Prejudice as an economic problem, we may have to turn that into its own video. This was just superb. Wow. Okay. Come back to one of my favorite authors, Jane Austen. How about that? Jane wrote so deeply and thought so deeply. She really did. Extraordinary. Well,
I knew
thanks.
You would like that story.
I
knew you would like that story.
I have to say,
I loved that story too. Kind of made me think I wish I studied law. I mean, who knew?
So one of the topics I teach is property to first-year students, and we teach future interest and go into ancient legal history. And I always give a lecture on the key problem in Pride and Prejudice. So I've worked on this before. I've never written on it, but it's a long-standing interest.
Well, and could that be a place where we start with our 3-word meme? I don't know. I mean, just it's stories like that pick up something that everybody can really grasp.
You have to pass something. You have to pass something on to the future that's effective. I mean, we have some responsibility to the future, is what we're saying. We don't want to burn through all the antibiotics now and leave your children and grandchildren bereft.
No kidding. And I think that's a great way to end this conversation. The whole goal of all this stuff we've been talking about is ensuring that we, our children and our children's children, will have the tools that they need. And right now, we're not really on a course to ensure that. Okay. Well, guys, thank you both ever so much for joining me today to have this conversation. Anthony, thank you. Wonderful paper. Tell your co-authors how much we enjoyed it. And thank all of you for watching and listening. See you next time.
See you next time. Thank you very much, Sean.
Well, that was fantastic. I mean, to have Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice surface in a discussion about economics, wow. Who knew? Well, what can I say? Thanks for listening, and as usual, like, comment, and subscribe for more. See you next time.